Hey folks, Roland Martin here, and hey, welcome to my YouTube channel. You know, lately I've had a lot of success in the YouTubes. I've had a lot of response from stories that I tell. And one of the neatest stories is my success of my son Scott. And just recently he won that big giant tournament on Lake Okeechobee, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about, how he first started fishing and how he got such a passion for fishing and then some of the things he did. But while I do that, I'm just going to make a cast or two, and I might even catch a bass or two. So let's just try something. Let's get a couple lures out first before I start talking about Scott's deal. And let's talk about a chatterbait, and let's talk about a worm. And I'm just going to make a cast down this bank. I'm just going to try something. Let's see what happens. Just to see what happens. I don't know if there's any fish here or not. I don't know. I don't know if there's anything here or not. You know, my son Scott is just a unique person. I just want to explain something. What his success right now is his own success. Scott is his own person. And all through the early teenage years that he had, I'd tell him things, and he would listen, and he would try stuff. But mainly, he did a lot of work. He did a lot of his own experimenting. And one of the stories that come to mind, it's such a big experiment, was I'd taken him out and I'd shown him a little bit about how to fish it's a little rapala, a little shad rap, a little shad rap. Anyway, he was 17 years old at the time. And what he did, he took one of his little high school buddies, and he entered a big tournament. And they had, I think it was 17 years old. He was 17 at the time, but he got some kind of exemption to fish this tournament. There were about 100 guys there, and these were top-notch people. There was a guy, Russ Springer, and there was a whole bunch of the really top-notch guys on the lake at the time, Steve Lloyd, and all sorts of big-time names that were fishing then. And by golly, he went to the Uncle Joe's Cut, took a little spinning rod with a little shad rap, and he and his high school buddy won the tournament. It wasn't much of a deal. It was like $1,000 deal. But it gave him that win, that first inkling that they could be a real good fisherman like I. Now, I want to back it up a little bit and talk about what happened last week. Last week, Scott went to Lake Okeechobee, the U.S. Open, and he won not only the tournament, he won the B.A.S.S. invitational on Lake Okeechobee, but he set a record doing it. Now, he set a record by catching 91 pounds. He had a 33-pound bag one day with 5 fish. He had a 31-pound bag another day with 5 fish, and a 26-pound bag another day. Anyway, the point was he set a record. And when he got up on the stage, and I was lucky enough to be there with him, and he gave me some credit. It was really, tears came to my eyes when he said this. But he said, I owe a lot to my dad, talking about me. And he said, and he remembered when he was like 15 years old, we had a big tournament on Lake Okeechobee, and I was practicing for it. And I said, son, Scott, well, how about if you and I go out and maybe you can help me find some fish? Okay, Dad. Okay, Dad. Well, at the time, he took a plastic worm. I just want to tell you, he took this little Cinco. Well, it wasn't a Cinco, but he took a plastic worm, much like this one. And he said, Dad, I'm going to throw this worm. And we were sitting between Bird Island and another little place, and there was some grass out there. And anyways, he took the worm and threw it out to kind of a nondescript place. And I don't know, all of a sudden, he just bam, he set the hook. He had a great big old bass, about 4 or 5 pounds. I said, son, that's a nice bass. He said, yeah, that's a good one, Dad. And so he kept fishing, and I actually caught more fish that day than I did. But what it did, here was the whole deal about what Scott did that day, was he found the fish, number one. He showed me how to catch them, number two, the way he was working the worm and the type of worm it was. And I went back and won the tournament. Now, that was really, really a cool deal. And he remembered that. He was on stage just last week, and he was saying, 30 years ago or however many years ago it was, he remembers how he helped me out win a Bass Invitational on Lake Okeechobee as well. So that's the kind of, Scott's his own fisherman, his own guy. And so that was such a big deal for him. And he remembered that. He remembered how he found the fish that day. He figured out how to catch them that day, and and it allowed me to go ahead and win a tournament. Now, here's the funny thing: in his win just this last week, he set a record. I mean, a whole lot of fish. I mean, 30-something pounds. The tournament that I won some 30 years ago that he helped me with, hey, that wasn't anywhere near as much weight. It was only half as much weight. So my fish, instead of being 6-pound average like his were, mine were like a 3-pound average. But it was still relative to the deal. And one of the reasons why Scott is now on those kind of fish is, you know, in the world of fishing, there's things change all the time. New patterns come up all the time. I wrote a book, 101 Bass Catching Secrets. It's all about, you know, drop shot. It was all about power fishing. It was all about flipping. It wasn't about forward-facing sonar. You know, right now the craze is forward-facing sonar. They take these units like the Active Target by Lowrance or the Garmin units, and they actually scan the area out here. Like if this were the if this were the scan, he'd scan it. He could see a bass over there on the shoreline. He could see a bass over by this bush. Now here's the problem, and here's what Scott did that was such a cool deal. And I'm with Scott a lot. He'll scan and he'll see a fish on the depth finder. He'll see some grass and he'll see, Dad, there's a fish. I said, yeah, I see it. He says, but it's not a bass. I said, well, how do you know that? He said, I can tell. I can tell the difference between a bass and, say, a tilapia. Well, I'd scan the thing around and he'd see another one. He'd say, oh, there's a bass now. And so the point was that Scott could, I get professional overruns from time to time. We all do that. Scott could scan with the forward-facing sonar, and he could see that was a bass. Now here's the key to what he did. Once he saw the fish, and here's the new modern trend of fishing. You see a fish by a weed. You see a fish, say, by the bank. I'm going to pull it out of that weed. And let me make a better cast. And what he did was he saw the fish. He'd throw the worm or the little other bait. He'd throw it there right by it, right by the fish. Now he'd see it now, and he's looking at it on the forward-facing sonar. And as he twitches it just a little bit, he twitches just a tad. The fish might react to it, might turn towards it, and he'd work a little bit farther. And maybe he hit it, maybe he wouldn't hit it. Now that last day of the tournament, he only had one fish at 11 o'clock. The fish weren't very active. He hadn't found very many. But finally at about 11 o'clock, he found a fish, or 10 o'clock, he found a fish, and it was a big one. He could tell it was a really big one. And he knew that he was way ahead in the tournament, already about 15 pounds ahead, going into that last day, that he needed just one more really big fish and he'd have it clinched. He'd have the tournament in the bag. And so sure enough, at about, I don't know, 11 or 12 o'clock, he finally caught the bass. After working with it for 1 hour, he finally caught a 9-pound bass. And at that point, he knew he'd won the tournament, even with just the 2 fish that he had, because he was so far ahead. But the point was, he had seen that fish, he'd thrown to it countless times. I don't know how many times he threw to that one bass, but he would watch it. His head was down, it was on camera, and he would see the fish and he could get right to it. If it wasn't a good cast, he'd make a little adjustment, and he'd throw it right in there again, and sure enough, he'd watch it move. He'd watch the fish move, and finally, after 1 whole hour, the bass took the bait. I think it was a worm that he used. But anyway, the point is, Scott is his own person, and he's just built a real dynasty for himself now. He's won I think 7 or 8 FLW tournaments. FLW is another circuit, and this is the first B.A.S.S tournament that he's won. And so he's kind of, in one respect, he said a couple of years ago when he had won a big tournament on the FLW trail, he said, I'd like to go back on the bass trail like my dad, like me, and set some records as well. And now he's starting to set records on the bass trail. So the point was, in my career, I pretty much stuck to bass the whole time. And I did a little bit of work with the FLW, and I did fair on the FLW circuit, and I fished with Scott on the FLW circuit as well. and I was with him on the Potomac River when he won the big time that on the Potomac, and that was the time. I just have to tell you that back it up a little bit. See, we like to fish together. Scott and I like to fish together. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I was fishing the FLW trail with Scott on the Potomac River. And sure enough, we were sharing some fish. We had plenty of fish in the Greenway Flats, and he was catching like 20, 25 pounds a day. And he was really doing it. And I was doing almost as good, not quite as good, but I was doing pretty good. And I was in the top 10. I would have been in the top 10. What happened the last day was so crazy. The last day, Scott comes to the dock and he says, Dad, he says, how'd you do? And I said, I got a big limit, Scott. I got 17 or 18 pounds. It's going to put me in the top 10 for sure. He said, oh, that's really good. I said, how'd you do, son? He says, I blasted him. I got 20-something pounds. I think I'm going to win the tournament. I want to stress one other fact, and that is he's his own person. He sets his own pattern. He's the one that created so much of this forward-facing sonar technology. He's worked with Garmin for these 10 years, and he's on the top of the chain. I mean, he can do this better than just about anybody. There's a Jacob Wheeler that does well. There's 2 or 3 other guys that have the technology as well and can do some of this like Scott could do. But there's only a handful of people. I can't do it as well. I have the units. I can use them, but not as well as those guys. Not as well as my son Scott. So I just want to congratulate him as well and just tell you that I'm really a proud father to have a son that's so productive in the tournament trails now. And such a great guy, and then tell you to cap it all off. I'll tell you what happened yesterday. I'm out fishing. I get a phone call from Springfield, Missouri, from the main Bass Pro Shop desk, and I know exactly who it is because when Johnny Morris makes a phone call, he goes through the desk, and sure enough, I got Johnny's secretary on the phone, and Stephanie says, Roland, Johnny's on the phone. He wants to talk to you. And I was so happy. And the first thing Johnny Morris said to me, he says, Roland, congratulations for having, your son doing such a good person. And also, Scott's a spokesperson for Lake Okeechobee. He wants to see the water quality improved. And so does Johnny. Johnny's got some interest in Lake Okeechobee as well. So anyway, they're kind of everybody's working together on the fact. So Johnny was really excited for me and for Scott, and he gave me a big congratulatory thing. And also, I'm going to be with Johnny next week because we're going to be opening up some stores right after the Bassmaster Classic, actually in March. We'll be going out to California and opening a brand new Bass Pro Shop in California. So that's kind of coming up on the agenda. Then Jimmy and I and Johnny are going to do some fishing down in southern Oklahoma that week as well. Anyway, that's what's happening right now. And boy, I tell you what, I'm just so proud of Scott. And I wanted to just tell you that little story about how he's come along these many years and how he's turned himself into such a great fisherman. Hey, thanks for watching. Hey, hit that YouTube, hit that subscribe button. I tell you, all my people, my O'Reilly people, my Bass Pro Shop people, they'll be just tickled to death that you're giving a shout to watching some of these videos. And we hope we teach you a few things along the way. Hope you have a good time watching. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.